Or how about total passes, tackles, assists? They're all available on every match. Boyle Sports. This is betting. Gamble responsibly. See gamblingcare.ie 18+.
Today, you can alleviate stress on your company finances and stress on the electricity grid by participating in demand response with NLX. By adjusting your energy usage for just a few hours per year, your business could receive a welcome revenue boost. And we could all benefit from a more sustainable future. With NLX, the power really is in your hands. To find out more, visit demandresponse.ie.
Have a niggling pain or injury that just won't go away? FCE Scan assesses the back, pelvis, legs and feet while you stand, walk and move. Our scans are used to seek the root cause of your injury, and then we provide you with the rehab to improve symptoms. Long term, all in just one appointment. Find out more at fcescan.ie.
At SEAT, we think it's time to feel brighter. Brighter about picking from our 7-seater Tarraco, the stylish new Ateca, or our crossover SUV, the Arona. Brighter about SEAT PCP finance starting from just 0% and an online discount voucher worth up to €2,000. And that's all available with a 3-year service plan for $9.99 a month. For more reasons to feel brighter, visit seat.ie. Finance provided by way of hire purchase agreement from Volkswagen Financial Services Ireland. Trading as SEAT Financial Services. Subject to lending criteria. Terms and conditions apply. Visit seat.ie for more.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power. Who needs Wes when you've got Jack Byrne, who also won't get his game? Gamble responsibly. Gamblingcare.ie.
Real Madrid against Chelsea getting underway at 8 o'clock. Miguel Delaney from the London Independent is with us. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Joe.
How you doing? So backdrop is interesting here, isn't it? Off the pitch as much as on the pitch. Oh, to have Perez and Abramovich in the same room somehow this evening. Opposite ends of the Big 12 spectrum, these two.
Yeah, very much so. Although, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, I did a piece this morning on Perez and the whole media industrial complex around him and the level of power he has in Spain. And while he doesn't outright own Madrid, Real Madrid, he has basically, the statutes have been changed, so he is essentially the only possible candidate as owner. And many people in Spain would literally describe him as an oligarch. So, I mean, you have different ends of the spectrum in terms of ownership, yet a few common threads, right down to ownership of the clubs, and even from what we hear, the running of the teams and understanding of football. I mean, you know, they've obviously both had certain fixations throughout their times as owner/president. Abramovich has actually always wanted a Barcelona style of play, not to sound like that famous meme. But to Abramovich, basically, a Barcelona style of play is essentially just like overhead kicks and lovely goals. And it's pretty much the same with Florentino Perez from everything you hear around him. He just likes, I can't even say this really, but for a 74-year-old man who's been in football as long as he has and presided over multiple European Cup winning teams, as someone put it to me today, it's almost like a 10-year-old's understanding of the game, where it's basically just, I want all of my stars out there and I want them in the same team. And it has been problematic for some Real Madrid managers. And there's often the theory that they've actually won multiple European Cups in spite of him rather than because of his ownership.
They also differ, of course, in their attitude to the European Super League, it would seem. Perez is still adamant this thing is going ahead one way or another. He's talking about binding contracts. There is a desperation, obviously, about certain clubs financially, whereas it would seem Chelsea were lukewarm to begin with, happy to go along and see where things went along with Man City, first to bail. So quite different when it comes to European Super League as well. I suspect Perez is not well disposed to how they've bailed.
Yeah, totally. In fact, I had a few people mention to me today, and when I was doing this piece, it'd be very interesting to see what the interactions would be like in the Madrid box. Now, of course, usually if it was in normal times, that'd be the presidential box at the Bernabeu, which is described as one of the most powerful places in Spain because it's where Spanish businessmen, international businessmen, heads of multinationals go and deals are literally struck. You know, it's where Perez and the club derive so much power from. But yeah, you're right. And I think it's not just that they pulled out, but also that Chelsea were one of the first to pull out. But there's also, I suppose, there's a different perspective here in terms of how they run the clubs, the reason they run the clubs, and also the motivation behind the Super League. Whereas, I mean, Abramovich, I mean, I suppose some of this is about it's a rich man's plaything. It's about Abramovich having an asset in London like that, and also I suppose it's about his own personal image. Whereas, so it is about, and that's one thing that's come a lot, come up a lot as regards Chelsea and some of the reasons they've pulled out. Now, the most obvious reason was that this thing was never really going to get off the ground because of the amount of legal and functional obstacles. But there was also the immense backlash, and Abramovich has obviously he's cultivated a program over the past few years where it's all been about Chelsea and the community and the good name of the club. I know it was someone at Chelsea that used the term to be toxic endeavour, whereas Perez is almost coming from the complete opposite perspective. He doesn't feel he has to please anyone, and the current situation and what you talk about there is where he still has this notion that the Super League is going to go ahead. Alexander Sheffrin rightly called him a flat earther in that way, but this is ultimately a man that's no one says no to him, and that's true. Like in terms of the Spanish media, right up to the hierarchy, if you want to use that term, at Madrid, because really his word goes.
As you said, you were writing about this today in the London Independent. It was very interesting, and Perez is no fool. His company employs 200,000 people in 60 different countries. It turns over €100 million per day. So it is huge, to say the least. That point you made about the presidential box at the Bernabeu almost being the epicenter of Spanish business and politics and sport and international business. Perez's role in all that, is he, on the phone to whoever he wants? Is his business empire founded on his Real Madrid position and vice versa? All of this stuff feels like it intersects in a huge way.
Oh yeah, I'd say it's more all self-fulfilling and self-perpetuating rather than being one necessarily dependent on the other. And because there are really it's an interconnected web here. I mean, as I suppose I go into that piece, this is, I suppose, how interesting the Super League story is, because of the amount of different strands it goes down and what it brings in. But Perez is a very specific product and expression of Spanish political and economic culture, which is basically after the war and after the end of the Franco dictatorship, there was a conscious effort to rebuild the Spanish economy on three pillars, which are basically the service industry, international tourism, and entertainment, which basically made football, the banks, and particularly the construction industry huge pillar stones in this. And basically, Perez has been involved in all three: politics earlier in his career, then onto he's an engineer by trade, then the construction industry, and then onto Real Madrid, with the three interweaving in so many ways. And of course, so much of it goes back when all this sort of discussion is referenced. So much of it goes back to that, I suppose, first massive deal he made as Real Madrid president back in 2001. Not the Figo or Zidane purchases, but basically in order to fund that initial Galactico program, he sold Madrid's original training ground to the state, so that the state could build a new commercial centre. But of course, so that was I think it ended up being worth about 500 million to Real Madrid. But which company got a lot of the contracts for that commercial centre? Well, ACS, Perez's company. So you can see all this interlinks, and even if you want to go even deeper, even with this, say with the Super League, JP Morgan, of course, putting up some or a lot of the financing. We don't know exactly, but JP Morgan were also responsible for financing the overhaul of the Bernabeu. But then I say there might have been other financing. There's been a lot of reports and links about Saudi Arabia's public investment fund potentially financing the Super League. And of course, again, some of that comes back to Perez's construction world contracts, given that his company has again been given the deal to build a kind of Las Vegas style entertainment city in Saudi Arabia.
Right, that sounds wonderful. We'll get to matters on the pitch. One last point you mentioned, which is kind of interesting in all this as well, is the Spanish media. So Marca, who see, I would have thought they were beholden to Madrid, but it was interesting they had super ridicule on their front page about this whole European Super League endeavour. But AS, is it AS or AS? I only ever read it. It is actually AS. Okay, AS.
Okay. You're not swearing on live radio.
Yeah, appropriately enough, AS on their website are so beholden to Madrid that they had headlines like Barcelona are criticised in England, sat next to things like Florentino has been courageous. So some fairly shameless, quote unquote, media over there as well. I know that's nothing new, but even with this, it's kind of striking, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's comic book stuff. Now, I mean, some of this is like some of it's a kind of a classic power dynamic in that, like we'd say with the case of that, with some of the media and some of the radio stations as well. Perez doesn't even really need to make a call. Some of them, they're so dependent on access to Madrid, and because Madrid is such an industrial complex in itself that it's almost like, from what I've heard, it's almost like a lot of things will be written because they think it'll align with the president's view. But then on the other side, I know of many stories of journalists in Spain, local journalists telling foreign journalists based in Spain or those over for Champions League games or whatever, please continue with the criticism because you can say what we can't. And funny, which actually did remind me of when at some Manchester United press conferences when some of the local journalists would ask a foreign journalist to ask Alex Ferguson something. But yeah, so essentially this whole media complex grown up around Madrid and Perez, where again he faces very little criticism. And like even that second day of the Super League, so it was the Monday, which is one of the longest days I've ever had in work. But like I finally sat down, finished at about midnight. Then I saw on Twitter that Perez was on this football magazine show, Chiringuito, which basically means bar stall, and it's quite notorious in Spain and considered quite tacky. And as someone in Spain said to me, this is kind of the level we're dealing with in terms of, the intellectual thinking behind the Super League. That this is where Perez is essentially selling his big idea. I mean, he was in very belligerent mood and essentially, and in a lot of cases, just relaying a lot of untruths. And as I said in that piece as well, from what I heard, there were a lot of Premier League clubs at that point as well. They're almost aghast at what he was doing. Like this is not how you sell a hugely controversial idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To matters on the field then, Madrid with home advantage this evening. They seem to have matched Chelsea up formation-wise. Varane is back in the centre of defence. Still no Sergio Ramos in there. Carvajal and Marcelo are the wing-backs. Of course, it's Modric and Casemiro and Cruz who are nearing 1,000 combined appearances for Madrid. And then it's Benzema and Vinicius, who really impressed, I think, against Liverpool, certainly in the first leg, are the two up front. As for Chelsea, Christensen, Thiago Silva and Rudiger, the back three. Azpilicueta and Chilwell, the wing-backs. Kante and Jorginho. Kante playing very well lately. And then Mount and Pulisic in behind Werner, who did score recently and also had a horror miss and kind of laughed about it afterwards. And I guess you could take that in a good way, that he's not overly stressed, but he's still not overly impressing either. But it's Werner who gets the nod up front for Chelsea this evening. I would be right in saying you thought Madrid ahead of the Liverpool game were at their poorest in a long time. Are you rethinking that now?
I still think now, I suppose, I think the line I used was it's the poorest Madrid since the 1970s. And some of this, of course, is relative to Real Madrid, because even in the 1970s, they were winning repeat Spanish titles. And I think they got to one European Cup semi-final at least. So, I mean, again, that's relative to Madrid. But I still kind of say, I've watched a lot of their league games as well since the Liverpool game. They're still just not that convincing. There's something missing about them. And I do wonder, it has to be said, they did raise it in that Liverpool game, and there was an intensity about them, particularly Vinicius. But also, I suppose in these sort of games, it really is about how both sides come up against each other. And as good as Madrid were in that first leg, Liverpool were really poor. What ended up being one of the most decisive elements, which is all the more shocking given it's Liverpool, was that there was basically an exclusion zone around Toni Kroos. Now, any Liverpool team between 2017 and 2020 under Klopp, they would have basically hounded him until he'd lost the ball. That was something that was so striking about it. And this Chelsea, they're obviously not at the level that Liverpool were for most of that period, but they've got a lot of potential. And currently they feel just a kind of a more competent team without being spectacular yet. And my thinking ahead of the game would be that they're just a bit too composed and have a bit too much about them for that they're kind of a more calculated side. But then again, I suppose as we've pretty much been saying for the last few years, or even the last 40 years, this is Madrid in the Champions League, the European Cup, and they do just have that capacity to raise it. And of course, just I suppose to bring this full circle, it's one of the things that has struck me with the last week as well, and that was such a pity. I mean, why Madrid were so willing to abandon this competition, because when you think of the European Cup, you think of kind of classic matches against Real Madrid. Even going back to the Busby Babes and the real tragedy competition, it was a match against Real Madrid that gave a certain evocativeness to the Busby Babes a year before the Munich air disaster. And like with these Champions League games tonight, it's not a contextless game between two super clubs. It's kind of a flat occasion that so many Super League games would have. It's built on 66 years of history, so every moment is kind of enriched by that. And that's what playing Real Madrid means, and kind of what they can draw on on occasions like this. Yeah.
Have you got a leaning either way? Strong one for this semi-final over the two legs?
I'm going to go Chelsea to win. I'll say 3-2 on aggregate. And I'm going to go for Paris Saint-Germain on the other leg, actually.
Right. Okay. Very good.
Well, maybe let's go tomorrow.
Well, listen. Feed up. Enjoy. Thanks a mil.
Cheers, Joe.
Cheers. Miguel Delaney there of the London Independent with us. Our football coverage is with thanks to Paddy Power. For information on responsible gambling, visit gamblingcare.ie. We have Ken Doherty on the way after 8 o'clock, by the way.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power. Who needs Wes when you've got Jack Byrne, who also won't get his game? Gamble responsibly. Gamblingcare.ie.
Sean, what's that thing going round the garden?
That is our new Husqvarna Automower.
Automower?
Yeah, it's a robotic lawnmower from Husqvarna. Cuts the grass automatically, has GPS tracking and an app. Even works in the rain. I just thought, why spend time cutting grass when I could spend it with the family?
Great!